Everything around you is dimmed now, screens low, engines humming softly in the background. You're settled, breathing slow, everything stable. The story ahead moves like a slow patrol through empty space. Let's step into it. The tunnels under the ice did not smell like a place where people lived. They smelled like hot metal sweating into cold air, like lubricant that had been burned once and never fully replaced, like the breath of a machine that could not afford to stop. When we arrived, the transfer node was already working past its limits. The pump thrum came up through my boots and into my knees, steady and heavy, like a distant drum you could not escape. The walls were layered with frost where warm lines ran behind them. Every few meters, condensation fogged into the air and then froze again in thin feathers along seams and bolt heads. Light from our helmet lamps broke into cones and died fast in the vapor. Everything that wasn't in the lamp beam was just black. The surface war did not reach down here in any direct way. No sky, no horizon, no heroic vistas. Just a buried artery feeding heat and oxygen mix to a crater settlement that had been built on the assumption that the node would never fail. The settlement's people never saw these tunnels. They saw dashboards and green indicators. They saw warm breath on their children's cheeks. Down here, you could feel how fragile that warmth was. We were reinforced infantry, but not the kind that marched. We were the kind they poured into cracks when the structure started to split. They dropped us into a service lock 6 kilometers from the node, and we walked the last stretch because rails were down and the magnetic tracks had been carved open by something with patience. I carried the heavy support gun in an external clamp on my suit's right side. The exosuit was old and mismatched. Left arm actuator from a newer batch, right hip servo that stuttered when it got cold. The gun was magnetic acceleration with a thermal sleeve, built to throw mass and heat through anything that wanted to pretend armor was a promise. It had modes that could chew through composite, cut through light alloy, or flash a plasma-edged burst for close work. It also drank coolant like a dying man drinks water. Our internal comms were already smeared when we sealed the lock behind us. The pump field interfered with speech clarity. The enemy's ECM sat somewhere in the same band, making every message a wet scrape of half words. The command net above us was worse. Only the local squad channel held, and even that was full of broken syllables and clicks, like someone biting down on gravel. The tunnel air was pressurized but thin. A worker system, not a soldier's comfort. My suit kept a better mix inside the helmet, but the collar seal had worn in a way I could feel when the temperature shifted. A faint leak, a cold finger against the throat. I marked it in my head as an item, not a fear. Everything down here was items. The node itself sat in a widened chamber reinforced with ribs of metal sunk into the ice like the skeleton of a whale. Valve stacks rose from the floor in arrays, each tagged with faded paint that only meant something to technicians. The pump housings were wrapped in thermal blankets that were torn and refastened with cable ties. A maintenance platform hung along one wall, its railing bent. Someone had been dragged across the floor recently. You could tell by the way the frost had been smeared into dark, wet patches that were freezing again. The unit holding it before us looked like men who had been living in a tight pocket of air for too long. Their suits were coated with ice crystals where blood and coolant had sprayed and then frozen. Their eyes were dull behind faceplates. 2 of them sat against a valve pillar as if gravity had increased. A medic leaned over a third, hands moving with the economy of someone who had run out of prayers. No one gave speeches. There was no time and no space for it. We were shown the line like, you show someone where the leak is in a hull. The node had 4 main approaches. The primary transfer tunnel we had come through, a parallel maintenance spur that ran under the main line, a set of utility ducts overhead that webbed into the ceiling like ribs, and an emergency access hatch leading to an older shaft that had been sealed years ago and then reopened by something that did not respect seals. They had placed their heaviest coverage toward the primary tunnel and the emergency hatch. That made sense to anyone looking at a map. It did not account for the maintenance spur. The spur was narrow and choked with pipes, but it had an angle that let anything crawling through it come up behind the primary firing position. It was the kind of oversight that happened when people were tired and under pressure and trusting a diagram more than a body's sense of space. I walked it with my lamp beam low. I listened with my palm against the wall, feeling the vibration. There was the constant pump resonance, and then, under it, a different tremor that came and went in pulses. Not machinery. Not regular enough. Something moving in the ice, using the tunnel skin as a guide. I did not say it like a warning. I said it like a report. I pointed with a gloved finger because my voice was a smear in everyone's ears. They tried to send a micro-drone down the spur. It went 30 meters, and then the feed turned into static and snow. The drone's transponder vanished, not a clean loss. A disappearance, as if it had been wrapped in something that ate signal. The first breach did not come from the direction everyone watched. A ceiling grill 3 meters above the maintenance platform bowed outward. Bolts popped one by one, little metallic snaps that were swallowed by pump noise. The grill fell, spinning, and hit the platform with a clang that should have been loud, but the fog and metal dampened it. Something dropped through after it, too fast for shape, a blur and then a streak of movement along the platform's underside. Helmet lamps swung up. Targeting pips jittered in my display because the field down here made every sensor second-guess itself. Friendly tags flickered. Unknown tags were blank. The enemy did not broadcast, and our own system kept insisting it could not be sure about what it saw. A man at the platform's far end raised his rifle. He fired a burst upward into the fog. The round sparked against steel, and then something hit him from above. It was not a clean strike. It was a collision that carried weight. He folded backward over the railing, and the railing bent further, metal screaming softly. His suit didn't rupture, but his neck angle went wrong. He stopped moving without drama. His weapon clattered, muzzle still smoking, and then slid off into darkness below the platform. The second casualty was the one who tried to pull him back. The overhead duct opened like a mouth. A set of jointed limbs unfolded and latched onto the lip of the opening, dragging a body through with a motion that looked like a machine using an animal's logic. It was built for close spaces, low profile, segmented plating, hooks for traction. It had no eyes I could see, just sensor pits and antennae that twitched towards sound and heat. Someone hit it with a plasma cutting round. The flash lit the entire chamber white for a fraction of a second, turning frost into glitter and showing every line of grime. The round cut a strip off the thing's side. Not blood, not oil, something viscous and dark that steamed on contact with warm air. It did not scream. It dropped on the man and drove something thin and fast into the seam at his helmet. The seam held for half a second, and then the seal failed. Air and warmth rushed out. His faceplate fogged, then cleared, then fogged again as his breath became frost. He clawed at his collar with hands that could not find purchase in gloves. Then he stopped. We fired until we had to stop, not because the enemy was gone, but because the chamber became a place of ricochets and uncertain tags. The ECM spiked. My display flashed warnings that the targeting assist had degraded to manual. I did not care. I had been shooting long enough in bad conditions to know that the assist was a convenience, not a foundation. I took position at the mouth of the maintenance spur because it was still a blind angle. The spur's opening was framed by pipes that had been wrapped in insulation that had peeled away. Steam whispered from a cracked joint, turning to ice as it hit the cold air. The floor there was slick, black with frozen lubricant. I anchored the heavy gun's bipod into a seam in the floor plating and fed it mass rounds first, because in closed spaces, mass did not care about cleverness. Mass went through. The enemy came in pulses. Not like a human assault with shouted commands and a line of bodies, like pressure on a cracked seal. It would ease, then build, then suddenly force itself through a weak point. They used the ducts and the spur. They used the fog. They used the way our lamps made everything outside the beam invisible. A small shape would appear at the edge of light and then be gone. A shadow would detach from a shadow. A claw would catch a boot and pull. We lost drones fast. The micro-drones were meant to be eyes around corners, cheap and expendable. They lasted seconds. Signals died mid-flight. Some returned as tumbling scrap, their rotors cut. One came back trailing a filament that looked like a web strand, and when it hit the floor, it started to crawl on its own, dragging itself toward the warmest mass in the chamber. Someone stomped it. It popped under the boot and sprayed a mist that ate paint and turned metal white. We marked that area as contaminated and kept stepping around it because we did not have time to do anything else. Hours down there are not like hours on a surface. There is no sky to track, no sunrise to promise a change. There is only a cycle of alarms and the way your muscles start to tremble when they have been holding tension too long. We held the node because we had to. The pump station fed oxygen mix through insulated lines that ran like veins. If the enemy severed those lines or opened the wrong valves, the pressure would drop across entire sectors. People would wake up choking or not wake up at all. The war up top could be won or lost in 100 places. Down here, loss was immediate and quiet. I watched the maintenance spur the way you watch a wound you know will split. The tremor under the pump resonance came and went. It got closer. When it came through, it did not come like a single creature. It came like a coordinated use of space. A panel along the spur's ceiling blew outward, not from an explosion but from mechanical force. A segmented body slid through, then another. They hugged the ceiling and walls, using hooks that clicked softly as they found purchase. Their plating was matte, absorbing light. Their movements were efficient, not frantic. They did not waste motion. I fired. The gun's mass rounds hit the first one and tore it into pieces that slapped wetly against pipes. The pieces did not fall like dead meat. Some segments clung. Some parts kept moving for a second, trying to complete an action with no body. The second one folded and dropped, hit the floor, and then sprang forward, legs unfolding like knives. It closed distance faster than I could step back in the slick. I fired again, but at this range, the muzzle blast and pump fog turned everything into a white smear. The enemy collided with my suit's right thigh. I felt impact through the exosuit frame. It drove something into the armor seam, not deep enough to pierce, but enough to wedge. My suit's right hip servo stuttered. The leg locked for a fraction of a second. I solved it the way you solve mechanical failure under pressure, by applying more violence than the problem deserved. I pivoted with my left leg and brought the gun down like a club. The gun's barrel shroud struck the thing's dorsal plate. The plate cracked. Viscous fluid steamed up, smelling sharp and metallic. The thing's limbs scrabbled on my armor, trying to find a seam. It found the collar leak. It drove a filament toward it. I fired point blank. The plasma cutting round did what it was built to do. It cut. The flash burned my display for an instant and turned the fog into a sheet of light. The thing split. Half of it fell away. The other half clung for one last second. Hooks sunk into my suit's plating, and then it released as if a command had been withdrawn. My collar seal hissed. Cold air licked my throat. My suit compensated, pushing more mix, but the leak was now bigger. My internal warning panel flashed in the corner of my view. Micro breach, collar seal. We patched it with sealing foam. The foam was meant for hull seams, not skin seals, but it held. It hardened quickly in the cold, turning into a stiff ridge that pulled when I moved my head. I accepted it. Comfort was not part of the loadout. The enemy did not stop. It tested, it learned, it pushed harder where we were weak and pulled back where we were strong. At some point, the primary firing position toward the main tunnel started taking hits from behind. Not enemy rounds, physical impacts from within the node's own chamber. Something had gotten into the overhead duct web and was dropping down behind our line, forcing us to split attention. Every time a defender turned, the main tunnel pressure increased. Every time the main tunnel pressure increased, someone made a mistake in the darkness. We were holding, but we were holding in a way that looked like slow collapse. That was when I decided to move the heavy emitter. The node had a static plasma emitter mounted on a maintenance sled. It was meant for cutting seized valves during repairs. Someone had rigged it as a defensive tool, using it to lay a line of superheated arcs across a choke point. It had been placed to cover the emergency hatch, because that hatch had been the obvious fear. The maintenance spur was still only covered by my gun and whatever rifles could angle toward it through pipes and fog. If the spur became a breach lane, we would be fighting with our backs to the valves. There would be no space left for anything but close killing. Moving the emitter was not clever. It was physical work under fire in a place where the floor was slick and the air wanted to freeze your lungs. I disconnected the sled's power coupler and felt the vibration change through my gloves. The emitter's weight was ugly, dense, industrial, indifferent. The sled had small traction motors, but the magnetic pump field made them twitch. The control unit kept losing calibration. It wanted to drift in the wrong direction, pulled by forces it did not understand. I shoved. The exosuit helped, whining as actuators took strain. The sled moved an inch, then slid sideways, then stopped as if caught on invisible teeth. I shoved again. Above me, the overhead duct web rattled. Something moved there, claws on metal. My lamp beam caught a flicker of matte plating and then nothing. I kept pushing because stopping would have meant the decision was wrong, and there wasn't room for wrong decisions. There was only room for decisions that bought time. A round hit the sled's side. Not ours, not human. It was a small penetrator that embedded then detonated a fraction later with a sharp crack. Shrapnel sprayed. One fragment found the gap at my right shoulder where old armor met newer plating. It punched through the outer layer and buried into flesh. Pain came, bright and clean for a second, then got buried under stim and necessity. A second penetrator hit. This one struck the node's wall beside me and blew ice spall into the air. The spall came off in jagged shards that whipped like thrown glass. Several hit my helmet and rang, each impact a dull bell in my skull. One found the edge of my collar foam patch and tore it. The hiss returned, louder. The pressure in the chamber dropped a notch. You could feel it in your ears, a subtle change, as if the tunnel inhaled. A seam somewhere had opened. The enemy knew how to use pressure as a weapon. Venting made fog shift. It made lamps scatter. It made people panic even when they thought they were beyond panic. My suit alarms stacked, collar seal failing, oxygen consumption rising, right hip servo overheating from the earlier lock, shoulder penetration bleeding into the soup liner. I pushed the sled anyway. The third impact was not a round. It was a body. Something dropped from the duct web and struck the maintenance platform above me. The platform flexed. The railing screamed softly. The thing sprang off and landed on the sled, claws biting into its casing. It was larger than the earlier crawlers, built more for force. It had a forward plate like a shield and limbs that could compress and extend like pistons. It turned toward the exposed power coupler at the emitter's base. If it severed that or shorted it, the emitter would die. If the emitter died, the spur would be open. I fired at it from a meter away. Mass rounds tore chunks from its shield plate. The plate absorbed, cracked, and then split. The thing kept moving. It drove a limb into my chest plate, not to pierce but to shove me back off balance. I slid on the black ice of lubricant. My right hip servo stuttered again, and my leg half locked. My knee hit the deck hard enough to jar teeth. The thing moved for my collar. It had learned. I grabbed the emitter's casing with my left hand and pulled myself upright in a motion that hurt my shoulder wound. The exosuit assisted with a mechanical groan. I drove the gun's muzzle into the thing's underside and fired plasma-cutting rounds in rapid sequence. The flash burned my display again. The heat turned fog into boiling white. The thing's underside opened. Viscous fluid spilled. Some of it hit the deck and instantly steamed, leaving a bitter chemical smell. It didn't fall. It clung, hooks sunk into metal, trying to complete the severing action. Its limb found the coupler and squeezed. The coupler sparked. Electricity arced in thin blue veins. The arc jumped to my glove and bit. My suit dampened it, but I felt it through the liner as a deep punch. I fired again until the gun's thermal sleeve alarm screamed and my coolant indicator dropped into red. The thing finally released, not because it chose to, but because its joints stopped working. It slid off the sled and collapsed in a heap of segments that still twitched for a second, like a machine refusing to accept that it was done. I did not look at it any longer than needed. I dragged the emitter sled into the spur angle and jammed it there. I reconnected the power coupler with hands that shook from exertion and shock. The coupler sparked again, but it held. The emitter's control panel lit, numbers jittering under interference. I set it to a low arc line across the spur opening, a curtain of heat that would not stop everything but would force anything coming through to commit and be seen. The first wave after that was uglier. The enemy did not throw itself into the arc line blindly. It sent smaller units first, bodies that could take loss, to probe the arc. The arc cut them. Pieces fell smoking. The smell was sharp, like heated metal and burned oil, but not oil. The arc left residue that froze into black flakes. Behind them came drones. Not our drones. Their drones were small and fast, like insects made of dark alloy. They moved in swarms, and they did not care about loss. They flew into the arc, popped, and in popping they threw out a mist that clung to the emitter's casing and started to eat insulation. It was chemical warfare at maintenance distance. We fired into the swarm. It was like trying to shoot rain. Some popped, some got through. One landed on my helmet and started to drill at a seam with a vibrating tip. I crushed it with my glove. The mist splashed and hissed against my armor. My suit's right hip servo finally gave a hard fault. The leg locked in a half-bent position. A warning told me the actuator had overheat protected. I could override it, but overriding meant it might burn out completely. Burned out meant dragging dead metal instead of a leg. I overrode it. The leg freed with a violent jerk. Heat spiked in the joint. I could feel the servos strain through the frame. The node chamber became a place of constant small failures. Seal foam patches cracking, rifle barrels overheating, lamp batteries dying, people slipping on blood that had frozen into black glaze. Every step was a choice between moving and falling. The enemy used venting again. A valve line ruptured near the ceiling, either from their action or from our damage. Warm oxygen mix vented into the cold and turned into a thick fog that rolled low. Our lamps made it brighter, but also made it blinding. Shapes moved in it, close and fast. Tags flickered. For 3 seconds, my display marked a friendly as unknown. For 3 seconds, a man hesitated, and that hesitation was enough for something to pull him into the fog. His tether line snapped a moment later, stretched and cut. The sound of it was soft, like cloth tearing. I kept firing because that was my job, and because stopping would have meant hearing more. At what might have been the midpoint of the engagement, if time meant anything down there, the enemy pushed in a coordinated mass along 3 approaches at once. The main tunnel, the overhead ducts, and now the spur. The arc line held the spur for a moment, but the chemical mist had degraded the emitter's insulation. The panel flickered. The arc stuttered. For half a second, it dropped. That half second was enough. They surged through, bodies low, hooks finding purchase on pipes. I fired mass rounds into the lane until the gun's feed jammed because frozen debris had gotten into the belt. I cleared it by hand, ripping my glove on jagged metal and not feeling it until later. The enemy got close enough that my rounds started punching into pipework behind them. Coolant lines burst. A spray of super cold liquid hit my left forearm and burned through the suit's outer layer. Cold burns are not like heat burns. They are silent and deep. The pain came later, when the tissue realized it was dead. Someone behind me fired a rifle burst. The round struck one of the crawlers and then skipped into the fog. A second later, a friendly tag went out. Not a scream, just a cut-off signal. The system chirped and then went blank. Friendly fire was not a moral event down here. It was an engineering outcome of interference and stress. The climax was not a single moment. It was a period of sustained close killing where the tunnel felt too small for the number of bodies it contained. I fired plasma-cutting rounds until my coolant hit empty. The gun's sleeve went from warning to fail-safe. The weapon locked its high heat mode to prevent catastrophic rupture. It left me with mass rounds only, which meant less immediate stopping power on close, jointed targets. I switched to mass and aimed for joints, hooks, thin points, places where mechanics mattered. I shot off limbs. I pinned bodies to pipe clusters. I watched segments still try to crawl with half a body, driven by something that did not require wholeness. My suit's collar seal finally failed again. The foam patch, torn earlier, had cracked under repeated movement. Air hissed into cold and out into darkness. My suit compensated harder. Oxygen consumption climbed. My internal mix stayed stable, but I could taste cold in the back of my throat. I did not panic. I cataloged it. I had a remaining time, and time was now just another resource like ammo and coolant. The emitter stuttered and died. Its panel went dark. The chemical mist had eaten through enough of its insulation to short it. When it died, the spur was open in a way that felt like a door you could not shut. We fell back 2 meters to a valve pillar line. The valve pillars were thick, and they created lanes. It was not a defensive plan. It was geometry we could use. The enemy came into those lanes, and we cut them apart. We used rifles, sidearms, knives, and the exosuit's own mass. We stomped on things that crawled. We crushed joints. We jammed severed segments into gaps and sealed them with foam, as if building a dam out of corpses. At some point, my shoulder wound stopped bleeding because the cold made it sluggish. My arm movement became heavier. The exosuit compensated, but compensation had limits. I saw my closest comrade, closest not in sentiment, but in the way you learn a person's rhythm when you share too many nights, move toward the overhead duct ladder. He was going to clear a blockage, or seal a hatch, or do something necessary. I tracked him for a second with my lamp beam, saw frost crystals on his helmet where earlier fog had condensed, saw the way his boots slipped once on the platform rung and then found purchase. Then the overhead ductweb shook. A larger mass moved in it. The ladder's bolts ripped from the wall, one by one, with a sound like teeth being pulled. The comrade fell with the ladder, down into fog. His tag flickered. It held for a heartbeat. Then it cut out. I did not go to him. Going would have meant leaving my lane open. Leaving my lane open would have meant the valve line behind me being cut. If the valve line was cut, the node would depressurize. If the node depressurized, the settlement would start dying above us in a way no one would see until it was too late. I stayed where I was and kept firing. The enemy pressure eventually eased, not because we had destroyed all of them, but because their objective was not to die down here. It was to sever flow. They had tried. They had not succeeded. They pulled back into ducts and spurs, into ice seams and darkness. Silence arrived, the way exhaustion arrives. Not sudden, just the gradual absence of impacts. The pump thrum became the dominant sound again. Alarms still blinked, but fewer. Fog began to settle. Frost began to form on blood. The node chamber looked like a maintenance accident, not a battlefield. Bodies were scattered in positions that made sense only to someone who had been there for the sequence. A defender slumped against a valve pillar with his helmet cracked. Ice had formed in a flower pattern around the crack. Another lay face down, suit split at the hip, frozen dark fluid around him. Enemy segments were everywhere, matte plating contrasting with the pale frost, hooks still extended as if waiting for a command. We did a count, because that is what you do when the noise stops. Counting is the only thing that turns chaos into something that can be written down. I looked for the comrade's tag in the local net. Nothing. I looked for a body where the ladder had fallen. The fog was thinner now, but the area under the overhead platform was full of debris. The ladder lay twisted. A smear of dark fluid led into a utility gap too narrow for my suit. We called it. Not in words. In the way people stopped searching after a certain number of seconds because oxygen and time were still resources. Morning did not exist down here, but shift change did. Relief elements came on the schedule that assumed the node would be intact enough to accept them. They arrived late. When they came through the lock, their suits were clean. Their lamps were bright. Their eyes were sharp with the ignorance of people who had not been in the chamber during the worst of it. They took over positions with the careful movements of newcomers stepping into a place that still held danger. They started sealing ducts properly. They started tracing chemical residue. They started doing what should have been done before the assault if there had been time. A medic grabbed my arm and guided me toward the lock. I went because my leg servo was smoking, my collar seal was leaking, and my oxygen reserve was down to a number that was no longer abstract. In the lock, with the inner door sealed, the pressure equalized. The sudden stability made my body notice damage it had been ignoring. My shoulder wound throbbed. My left forearm burned with cold, dead pain. My ribs hurt when I breathed. My hearing was a thin ring, and then nothing else. They peeled my helmet off carefully because the collar foam patch had hardened into a ridge. Warm air hit my face. It smelled like disinfectant and human breath. It felt wrong, like being reminded there was a world not made of metal and ice. I sat on the lock bench while they worked. I watched my own blood drip onto the floor, grating and freeze into dark beads. I watched the medic's hands move with practiced speed, cutting away liner, spraying sealant, pressing synthetic skin patches over torn flesh. Someone tried to ask questions through the comm smear. The medic ignored them. I ignored them too. My mouth felt full of cold. When they asked for the account, I gave it the way I am giving it now. Like an inventory, not a confession. I listed what I saw. I listed what failed. I listed what held. I did not use names because names down there were just noise. The system would fill them in later from tags and reports. What I could not list was the shape of the absence. The comrade's body did not come out of the utility gap. The enemy had taken him into a space built for cables and cold air. They might have killed him there. They might have used him for something. It did not matter for the settlement above. For the settlement above, the oxygen lines stayed warm. People woke up and went to work. Children breathed and did not know their breath was an output of violence in a tunnel they would never see. For me, the last clear image of that engagement is not the killing. It is not the flashes. It is not the hook limbs or the chemical mist. It is the way warm oxygen fog rolled low across the chamber when the valve line ruptured, and how it crystallized on blood. The fog hit the blood and made it look brighter for a moment, red under lamplight, and then the red turned dark as it froze. The crystals formed on it like delicate feathers, white on black, beautiful in a way that made no sense. Then Boots stepped through it and broke it into powder. That is what I remember when the medic's light goes dim at the edge of my vision and my suit alarms are gone, and it is just my own breathing left to count. The end. The last moments fade out, leaving only the calm stillness after a long mission. You're safe, warm, and unburdened. Close your eyes and drift.